The Queen. Dawn came at last, and the rim of the lemon-colored sun rose up behind the rooftop somewhere behind Victoria Station. A while later, Sophie felt a little bit of its warmth on her back and was grateful. In the distance, she heard a church clock striking. She counted the strikes. There were 7. She found it almost impossible to believe that she, Sophie, a little orphan of no real importance in the world, was at this moment actually sitting high above the ground on the windowsill of the Queen of England's bedroom, with the Queen herself asleep in there behind the curtain, not more than 5 yards away. The very idea of it was absurd. No one had ever done such a thing before. It was a terrifying thing to be done. What would happen if the dream didn't work? No one, least of all the Queen, would believe a word of her story. It seemed possible that nobody had ever woken up to find a small child sitting in the curtains on his or her windowsill. The Queen was bound to get a shock. Who wouldn't? With all the patience of a small girl who has something important to wait for, Sophie sat motionless on the windowsill. How much longer? She wondered. What time do queens wake up? Faint stirrings and distant sounds came to her from deep inside the belly of the palace. Then, all at once, beyond the curtains, she heard the voice of the sleeper in the bedroom. It was a slightly blurred sleep talker voice. Oh no, he cried. No, don't. Someone stop them. Don't let them do it. I can't bear it. Oh, please stop. It's horrible. Oh, it's ghastly. No, no, no. She's having the dream, Sophie told herself. It must be really horrid, and I felt so sorry for her. But it has to be done. After that, there were a few moans. Then there was a long silence. Sophie waited. She looked over her shoulder. She was terrified that she would see the man with the dog down in the garden staring up at her. But the garden was deserted. A pale summer mist hung over it like smoke. It was an enormous garden, very beautiful, with a large, funny shaped lake at the far end. There was an island in the lake, and there were ducks swimming in the water. Inside the room, beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the doorknob being turned. She heard someone entering the room. Good morning, Your Majesty, a woman was saying. It was the voice of an oldish person. There was a pause and then a slight rattle of china and silver. Will you have your tray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table? Oh, Mary, something awful has just happened. This was a voice that Sophie had heard many times on the radio and television, especially on Christmas Day. It was a very well known voice. Whatever is it, ma'am? I've just had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful. Oh, I am sorry, ma'am, but don't be distressed. You're awake now, and it will go away. It was only a dream, ma'am. Do you know what I dreamt, Mary? I dreamt that girls and boys were being snatched out of their beds at boarding schools and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. The giants were putting their arms in through the dormitory windows and plucking the children out with their fingers. One lot from a girls' school and the other from a boys' school. It was all so vivid. Mary, it was so real. There was silence, and Sophie waited. She was quivering with excitement. But why the silence? Why didn't the other one, the maid, why didn't she say something? What on earth is the matter, Mary? The famous voice said. There was another silence. Mary, you've gone as white as a sheet. Are you feeling okay? There was suddenly a crash and a clatter of crockery, which could have only meant that the tray the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands. Mary, the famous voice sang rather sharply. I think you better sit down at once. You look as though you were about to faint. You really mustn't take it so hard just because I had an awful dream. That isn't the reason, ma'am. The maid's voice was quivering terribly. Then, for heaven's sakes, what is the reason? I'm very sorry about the tray, ma'am. Oh, don't worry about the tray. What on earth is it that made you drop it? Why did you go as white as a ghost? You haven't seen the papers yet, have you, ma'am? No, what do they say? Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper as it was being handed over. It's like the very dream you had in the night, ma'am. Rubbish, Mary. Where is it? On the front page, ma'am. It's the big headlines. Great Scott! Cried the famous voice. 18 girls vanished mysteriously from the beds of the Rotarian school. 14 boys disappeared from Eton. Bones are found underneath the dormitory windows. Then there was a pause, punctuated by gasps from the famous voice as the newspaper article was clearly being read and digested. Oh, how ghastly! The famous voice cried out. It is absolutely frightful. Bones under the windows? What can have happened? Oh, those poor children. But ma'am, don't you see, ma'am? See what, Mary? Those children were taken away almost exactly as you dreamt it, ma'am. Not by giants, Mary. No, ma'am. But the bit about the girls and boys disappearing from their dormitories, you dreamt it so clearly, then it actually happened. That's why I came over all queer, ma'am. I'm coming over a bit queer myself, Mary. It gives me the shakes, ma'am. When something like that happens, it really does. I don't blame you, Mary. I shall get you some more breakfast, ma'am, and we'll have the mess cleaned up. No, don't go, Mary. Stay here a moment. Sophie wished that she could see into the room, but she didn't dare touch the curtains. The famous voice began speaking again. I really did dream about those children, Mary. It was clear as crystal. I know you did, ma'am. I don't know how giants got into it. That was rubbish. Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am? And then we shall all feel better. It's a lovely day. Please do. With a swish, the giant curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed. Sophie froze to the window ledge. The queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream, as the maid had done. Queens are too self controlled for that. She simply sat there staring wide eyed and white faced at a small girl who was perched on her window sill in a nightie. Sophie was petrified. Curiously enough, the queen looked petrified too. One would have expected her to look surprised, as or would I have done with or I would have done had or would I have done had with the discovered a small girl sitting on the windowsill first thing in the morning. But the queen didn't look surprised. She looked generally frightened. The maid, a middle-aged woman with a funny cap on top of her head, was the first to recover. What in the name of heaven do you think you're doing in here? She shouted angrily at Sophie. Sophie looked beseechingly toward the queen for help. The queen was still staring at Sophie. Gaping at her would have been more accurate. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes were round and wide as saucers, and the whole of that famous, rather lovely face was filled with disbelief. Now listen here, young lady. How on earth did you get into this room? The maid shouted furiously. I don't believe it, the queen was murmuring. I simply don't believe it. I'll take her out, ma'am, at once, the maid said. No, Mary, no, don't do that. The queen spoke so sharply that the maid was quite taken back. She turned and stared at the queen. What on earth has come over her? It looked as though she was in a state of shock. When the queen spoke again, it was in a strange, strangled sort of whisper. Tell me, Mary, she said. Tell me quite truthfully, is there really a little girl sitting on the windowsill, or am I dreaming it? She's sitting there all right, ma'am, as clear as day, as clear as light, but heaven only knows how she got there. Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming it this time. But that's exactly what I did dream, the queen cried. I dreamt that as well. I dreamt there would be a little girl sitting on the windowsill in her nightie, and she would talk to me. The maid, with her hands clasped across her starched white bosom, was staring at the mistress with a look of absolute disbelief on her face. The situation was getting beyond her. She was lost. She had not been trained to cope with this kind of madness. Are you real? The queen said to Sophie. Yes, your majesty, Sophie murmured. What is your name? Sophie, your majesty. And how did you get up on my windowsill? No, don't answer that. Hang on a moment. I dreamt that part of it too. I dreamt that the giant put you there. He did, your majesty, Sophie said. The maid gave a howl of anguish and clasped her hands over her face. Control yourself, Mary, the queen said sharply. And then to Sophie, she said, "You're not serious about the giant, are you?" "Oh, yes, Your Majesty. He's out there in the garden now." "Is he indeed?" the queen said, the sheer absurdity of it all helping her to regain her composure. "So he's in the garden, is he?" she said, smiling a little. "He is a good giant, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "You need not be frightened of him." "I'm delighted to hear it," said the queen, still smiling. "He is my best friend, Your Majesty." "How nice," the queen said. "He's a lovely giant, Your Majesty." "I'm quite sure he is," the queen said. "But why have you and the giant come to see me?" I think you dreamed that part of it too, Your Majesty," Sophie said calmly. That pulled the queen up short. It took the smile right off her face. She certainly had dreamed that part of it. She was remembering now how, at the end of the dream, it said that the little girl and the big friendly giant would come and show her how to find the 9 horrible man eating giants. "But be careful," the queen told herself. "Keep very calm, because this is surely not very far from the place where the madness begins." "You did dream that, didn't you, Your Majesty?" Sophie said. The maid was out of it now. She stood there goggling. "Yes," the queen murmured. "Yes, now you've come to mention it, I did. But how do you know I dreamed it?" "Oh, that's a long story, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "Would you like me to call the big friendly giant?" The queen looked at the child. The child looked straight back at the queen. Her face opened and quite serious. The queen simply didn't know what to make of it. Was someone pulling her leg? She wondered. "Shall I call him for you?" Sophie went on. "You'll like him very much." The queen took a deep breath. She was glad no one except her faithful old Mary was here to see what was going on. "Very well," she said. "You may call your giant." "No, wait a moment. Mary, pull yourself together and give me my dressing gown and slippers." The maid did as she was told. The queen got out of the bed and put on a pale pink dressing gown and slippers. "You may call him now," the queen said. Sophie turned her head towards the garden and called out, "BFG! Her Majesty the Queen would like to see you." The queen crossed over the window and stood beside Sophie. "Come down off that ledge," she said. "You're going to fall backwards at any moment." Sophie jumped down into the room and stood beside the queen at the open window. Mary, the maid, stood behind them. Her hands were now planted firmly on her hips, and there was a look on her face that seemed to say, "I want no part of this fiasco." "I don't see any giant," the queen said. "Please wait," Sophie said. "Shall I take her away now, ma'am?" the maid said. "Take her downstairs and give her some breakfast," the queen said. Just then there was a rustle in the bushes beside the lake. Then out he came, 24 feet tall, wearing his black cloak with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand. He strode magnificently across the palace lawn toward the window. The maid screamed. The queen gasped. Sophie waved. The big friendly giant took his time. He was very dignified in his approach. When he was close to the window where the 3 of them were standing, he stopped and made a slow, graceful bow. His head, after he had straightened up again, was almost exactly level with the watchers at the window. "Your Magister," he said, "I is your humbug servant." He bowed again. Considering she was meeting a giant for the first time in her life, the queen remained astonishingly self-composed. "We're very pleased to meet you," she said. Down below, a gardener was coming across the lawn with a wheelbarrow. He caught sight of the BFG's legs over his left. His gaze traveled slowly upward along the entire height of the enormous body. He gripped the handles of the wheelbarrow. He swayed, he tottered, and then he keeled over on the grass in a dead faint. Nobody noticed him. "Oh, Magister!" cried the BFG. "Oh, Queen! Oh, Moniker! Oh, Golden Sovereign! Oh, Ruler! Oh, Ruler of Straight Lines! Oh, Salunta! I has come here with my little friend Sophie to give you a—" The BFG hesitated. searching for the word, to give me what? The Queen said. Assistance, the BFG said, beaming. The Queen looked puzzled. He sometimes speaks a bit funny, Your Majesty, Sophie said. He never went to school. Then we must send him to school, the Queen said. We have some very good schools in this country. I has great secrets to tell Your Majesty, the BFG said. I should be delighted to hear them, the Queen said, but not in my dressing gown. Shall you wish to get dressed, ma'am? The maid said. Have either of you had breakfast? The Queen said. Oh, could we? Sophie cried. Oh, please, I haven't eaten a thing since yesterday. I was about to have mine, the Queen said, but Mary dropped it. The maid gulped. I imagine we have more food in the palace, the Queen said. Speaking to the BFG, perhaps you and your little friend would care to join me. Will it be repulsant snobcumbers, Magister? The BFG said. Will it be what? The Queen said. Stinky snobcumbers, the BFG said. What is he talking about? The Queen said. It sounds like a rude word to me. She turned to the maid and said, Mary, ask them to serve breakfast for 3. I think it better be the ballroom. That has the highest ceiling. To the BFG, she said, I'm afraid you will have to go through the door on your hands and knees, and I shall send one to show you the way. The BFG reached up and lifted Sophie out of the window. You and I is leaving Her Majesty alone to get dressed, he said. No, leave the little girl here with me, the Queen said. We'll have to find something for her to put on. She can't have breakfast in her nightie. The BFG returned Sophie to the bedroom. Can we have sausages, Your Majesty? Sophie said, and bacon and fried eggs. I think that might be managed, the Queen answered, smiling. Just you wait till you taste it, Sophie said to the BFG. No more snog cucumbers from now on.